The first thing is that I have some people to thank. So the person on the left is my collaborator on the Iambic studies, and the one in the middle is the collaborator on the Spanish studies, and the two to the right are assistants, so graduate research assistant and undergraduate assistant in Texas who've helped with this study. So questions of interest for today's talk. One question that we have is, what are the units of rhythm in natural speech? So there have been a number of prominent proposals about this. One prominent proposal is the prosodic foot typology, which proposes we have a bimoraic trochee, and asymmetric iamb. This is Bruce Hayes' idea, and what some people sometimes forget is that pretty much the same typology was proposed by McCarthy and Prince in 1986 for prosodic morphology. And another important proposal around the same time was Halle and Vergniaud's proposal. One of the big differences between the two proposals is that in the Hayesian typology, stress heads were considered to be one with feet, whereas in Halle and Vergniaud's proposal, feet, stress heads were not primitives. You assigned the feet first, then you assigned heads, and then take it from there. So the next thing would be, the next question of interest would be, what acoustic information do listeners use to identify the forms of any of these feet and or their boundaries? And as a starting point, we can begin with the Iambic-Trochaic law, which provides for two grouping principles: elements contrasting in intensity naturally form groupings with initial prominence, and elements grouping that contrast duration naturally form groupings with final prominence. Okay. And so rhythmic feet are associated with stress oftentimes. So a next question would be, can we show that listeners use cues to identify grouping affinities in ways that can't be reduced to judgments of stress? And then another question would be, to what extent do native speakers of different languages make similar or different judgments based on the same information? And if we can find that they make different judgments based on the same information, then we can ask other questions, like, for example, are these differences due to language-specific differences, properties of the languages? If they are we talking about general perceptual tendencies that are being overridden by language-specific principles, tendencies? We don't know. So one of the one of the things about the Iambic-Trochaic law is it makes some fairly strong claims, but these claims haven't much been tested, and certainly not with speakers of many different languages. And so what I want to share with you today is a report on a sequence of perception experiments in which native speakers of three languages, English speakers and Spanish speakers and Zapotec speakers, were asked to subjectively group streams of alternating syllables into pairs. And the basis for alternation, since we're beginning with the Iambic-Trochaic law, the basis for the alternations were variations in intensity and vowel duration. So time permitting, we may not have time, but if we do, I'd like to perhaps share with you a little bit about some very fresh data in which we tested Zapotec speakers' grouping preferences, varying duration, and vowel glottalization cues. So a little more about that later if we have time. So what have people done as far as experimental tests of the Iambic-Trochaic law? Well, there have been a few, not much has been done really. So there have been a few studies that have been done with using non-speech sequences, and then there have been a few studies that have been done using speech-like sequences. So for the non-speech studies, Hay and Deal did a study in 2007. Probably the earliest studies, really, modern studies, if you like, were done by Kusumoto and Morton, 1997. Kurt Rice did a version in 1992. He should be up here. And Iverson and his colleagues did a study in 2008. And what they found for English is that English speakers have a loud, soft grouping bias when intensity is varied, and they have a short, long grouping bias when duration is varied. Very nice. French, we've found the same thing. Hay and Deal found this. And the results for Japanese have been mixed. So Iverson and his colleagues found that some Japanese speakers have a very strong preference for long-short groupings, and other Japanese speakers have quite a strong preference for the other way around. So some short-long, others long-short. And so that's essentially where it is for the non-speech sequences in studies of this kind. So for the speech-like sequences, Jessica Hay and Randy Deal paired their non-speech study with a twin study, if you like, in which they used sequences in which synthesized syllables were alternated, and they found the same thing for English and for French. They found that also with the speech-like stimuli, there was a preference for loud, soft, and for short, long groupings. And some Batara and al. In review have found similar findings for French and for German. And in a couple of other kinds of studies, recall studies, memory studies, for English, Morgan and her colleagues found a loud soft bias effect for English speakers, and Bayon et al., that would be Marina Nesper and her colleagues in this particular paper found a short long bias with Italians. So anyway, coming to the studies that we did. So the first studies that I'll talk about were paired studies in English and Spanish. And these were the sequences that we used were based on the preparation of stimuli began with natural speech. So we recorded an English speaker saying baga, 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 and then gaba, 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 and we basically selected syllables that were well matched for various parameters and combined them. And we combined them into sequences where we began the sequences with noise, and which fades out, and as the noise fades out, syllables fade in. And the idea is to trick people into not knowing exactly where the sequence begins, and then at the end of the sequence you have sort of another noise that's intended to backward mask the last syllable that they heard. And we chose two syllables, ba and ga, so that we didn't have to ask people, okay, well, you're going to hear things that are grouped into pairs. Where's the stressed syllable? Is it the beginning or is it the end? Or where's the longer syllable or where's the louder syllable? So this was meant to be a less direct measure of people's grouping preferences that abstracted away from asking about syllable prominence. So we varied we increased the we varied intensity and duration on a 9-point scale in this particular study. And basically, let me interpret the scale for you. The middle of the scale is basically the 0 point. So here we've got, this is basically the control point. This is where there's no difference either in loudness or length between the alternating syllables. And at -4, this basically is all relative to the syllable ba. So the idea is that here, ba is softer and shorter than the ga, and with the difference growing greater this way, and here we have them being the same length, and then at this end of the scale, we have ba growing louder and longer than ga. So basically, this looks like a complicated scale, but actually, really what it means is almost anything that I say regarding the statistics can really be interpreted this way. Going this way, in this case, where ga is the longer syllable, baga would be a a soft loud grouping, not a loud soft grouping, and then at the other end of the scale, a Baga grouping would be a loud soft grouping. So we chose the increments at which we varied intensity and duration to be consistent with other studies that have been done, other studies of this type that have been done. We tested subjects in groups. The English-speaking subjects were Austin, the Spanish-speaking subjects were in Mexico. And these subjects are all university students, so they're about as monolingual as we could get university students to be, which was to say in these cases they all had had a few semesters, say, of Spanish or French, but none of them were functionally bilingual in any language other than their native language. So they were tested in groups, and sequences were played over a loudspeaker. And their task was they were given an answer sheet that looked a little bit like what you see at the bottom of the slide, and where they had an arbitrary sequence of ba and ga syllables, and they were told, all right, anywhere on the line, anywhere at all, just group, bracket the pair that best represents what you think you're hearing in terms of, is the sequence repeating Baga units or is it repeating Gaba units? All right, so the hypothesis, since we're beginning with the Iambic-Trochaic law, was that the proportion of Baga responses, and we're choosing Baga simply because that's the arbitrary category for the analysis. So, given that we have this scale, given that Ba is softest or shortest here, the intensity principle predicts that if we prefer loud soft groupings, we should have a continuously increasing proportion of Baga responses. And the duration principle predicts essentially, the prediction for the duration principle is the opposite. If Ba is shortest at the lower end of the scale, then we should have the highest proportion of short-long groupings there, and they should go down from there. So basically, this is what we found. So what you see here is in the chart to the left is the solid lines are English and the dashed lines are Spanish, and the intensity are the circles and the duration are the squares, but that's a little hard to see. So let me show you that this right here represents our finding for intensity, and this represents our finding for duration. And what you can see is basically interpreting this particular finding. Basically what it means is it really does mean that if you start with this point, the 0 point right here, it is true that whichever way you're going, Ba getting longer, louder, Ba getting shorter, softer, we find that as the difference in the ratio at which either cue is varied, you do get more loud, soft groupings, and you do get more short, long groupings. So this is exactly what we would predict. Now, another thing that's interesting is that the effect that we got for intensity is massive. It's quite large. So, and the effects that we got for duration were larger in English than they were for Spanish. But basically, what you see up here, and I'll not go over the technical details too much. There's a paper if you would like to know more, but the odds ratio, basically what we're talking about is the likelihood of a particular outcome. And what this particular statistic tells us is that, interpreting is that a loud, soft response was twice as likely for every unit of increase in intensity. And in the English case and in the Spanish case, we get an even larger. We have that a unit of increase in intensity in the Spanish case increases the odds 3 times of getting a loud, soft response. And we see that in the case of the duration, a negative value means that something is less likely. So what we're seeing here in the English case is that for any unit of increase in duration, in this particular case, the Baga response is actually 44% less likely than. So So these were nice effects to find. These are sequences in this particular study. The sequences that we used varied only intensity or only duration, but in fact, so essentially what we see is that we did get more loud, soft responses. We did get more long, short responses. The effect sizes are larger for intensity than for duration, and they're larger for the Spanish than for the English group. So. But in the next study, what we did was we included the same kinds of sequences on a more modest scale, so no more 9-point scales, but we also included sequences in which we varied both intensity and duration in the same sequences. And we varied them in two ways. If you have alternating bisyllabic pairs, you can vary intensity and duration so that they compete, or you can vary them so that they cooperate. So if you're in the cooperating case, what you do is you make every other syllable louder and the complement syllables longer, so that a baga grouping in that case could be, in that case what you'll get is a loud, soft grouping will at the same time be a short, long grouping, and this is the outcome that should be favored by the Iambic-Trochaic law. In the competing condition, on the other hand, what you do is you vary them so that one syllable is both louder and longer, and the other one is shorter and softer. And in that case, the same syllable cannot be in two places at the same time. So, all right. So. It was a 5-point scale in this case, but the range, so the units of increase in this case were 6 decibels for intensity, which is a lot. We'll talk about that later. And the units of increase for duration were 30 milliseconds, so that for all of these studies, by the time I have 5 minutes left. Okay. All right, because. So I might need you after all, because this didn't work. Oh, we're good. So we have a 5-point scale. The maximum ratio for the duration manipulation was basically 2 to 1. And the thing in the bottom left doesn't matter so much as to show you that this was a fully counterbalanced design. That's all that that's for. So what this is intended to show you is that for every value for intensity was crossed with every value for duration. So, as before, we have exactly the same hypotheses for just basic intensity and duration, but the issue would be what happens in the competing and the cooperating conditions. So, we might. What we're doing here, one of the things that's driving this research really is to. We've talked about grid-based and foot-based analyses or treatments of stress, but in this case, really. What we're after is to see if we can find evidence for the groupings independently of stress. So we do at least need to talk about what kinds of cues might be associated with stress so that we know what we're not looking for or what else we should be looking for. So we do know that in English, acoustic correlates of stress have been much studied, and we know that the most reliable physical correlate of non-accent stress in speakers' productions are increased vowel duration, and to a lesser extent, greater intensity. And we also know that English speakers may tend to rely more on vowel duration than on intensity in identifying word stress. And we know some work has shown that in Spanish, speakers use increased duration more reliably than intensity to signal stress contrasts in both accented and unaccented contexts. And that listeners may also rely more on duration in identifying word stress. So all of this is telling us that if we're talking about stress, duration seems to be a very important cue, and intensity sometimes less important or used in different ways. In Spanish, for example, I believe that Marta Ortega and colleagues have argued that intensity is an important cue, but more for accent stress than for word level stress. So, hypotheses in the cooperating condition, we should just get loud, soft, short, long groupings. That shouldn't be a problem. And in the competing condition, we don't know. We don't know which one is going to win. So what did we find? Well, what you see before you is wire graphs that basically show you how the interactions between the predictor variables that we're looking at. And the important thing here is to note that what you see here is the lines going up this way indicate intensity variations on both graphs, and the lines going this way indicate duration manipulations. And an important thing that we see here, the main thing here that you see is that the intensity of the shading, so the darker the color, the more loud-soft groupings we're getting. Okay, so this is done in terms of loud-soft groupings. And you can see that we have a starker effect in Spanish again than we did in English. So we can take this apart a little bit to show you what this is still doing. This is intensity, but what we've done is we've taken all of the different lines for duration and we've separated them out. So the black lines are the single parameter strings, only duration, only intensity. And then the blue lines are one magnitude either way, so either above or below. And then the red lines are the extremes, so two magnitudes above and below. And what you can see is that the intensity contour is being affected by what's going on with duration, and that we seem to be getting a bigger effect of that in English than perhaps we are in Spanish. So that's there for you later if you would like. But anyway, so what we found is that, okay, what do we find in English? In the intensity-only condition, so this is where it was only intensity varying, again, we have the odds of having a loud-soft response are very high, almost for 1 unit of increase on average raises the odds of a loud-soft response almost 4 times. And in the covariate conditions, it goes down. Okay, it goes down in those conditions on average. A unit of increase raises the odds only about three times. So in Spanish, the odds are enormous. So you can see that the effect size, the odds ratio is also a nice measure of effect size. What we're seeing here is that the effect size associated with intensity in Spanish it's much greater than it is for English. And it may be relevant, I didn't tell you this to begin with, but I'm not sure, but it may be relevant that the Spanish speakers were tested with the same strings that the English speakers were tested with. These were strings that were recorded with an English speaker. So in the case of duration, in English, the statistic we find with the duration-only strings is comparable. And what we find in the covaried sequences is that the odds, what we have here is that the effective intensity on success is lower by about, it's only about 0.72 for every unit of increase in duration for every unit of increase in duration. And we see this was highly significant. And we see that in the case of the Spanish data, really not very much is going on with duration at all. And neither of these things was significant. So, okay, all right. So, in the interactions here. So these were duration only in the duration in the covaried conditions, and duration only again in the covaried conditions. Now we're going to get to the interactions. On the next slide. And so what we see is that what the interesting effect for us is in the competing conditions. So in the competing condition, a Baga response was Baga. And so loud, soft, and long, short. So what happens? So what we have here is in English, the interaction of these two variables was this. And what that's telling us is that the effective intensity on the probability of success, there's the line, was 0.87 times less for units of increase in duration. So what we're seeing is that increasing duration increases short-long responses, as we might expect. All right, so now we come to the Zapotec study. So the dialect of Zapotec that we worked on was a northern dialect of Zapotec. And some phonological features of Batassa Zapotec that would be interesting. This is where it's spoken. I should also say that these are not monolingual speakers, but they are Zapotec dominant speakers. This was done in a small village in the mountains in Oaxaca where everybody, is a Zapotec speaker, 100%. And Zapotec really is the language that people speak at home, that people speak in the streets, although younger people, can all, I would say probably under the age of 50, all speak Spanish, but everyone speaks Zapotec in the village. So phonological features of interest. So this is a language that contrasts modal checked and rearticulated vowels. And it has no phonological vowel length contrast. Stress is morphologically determined. It's always root initial. It has four contrastive tones, high, low, falling, rising, with high, low, and falling being the most common ones. And there doesn't seem to be an interaction with stress of the kind that Paul de Lacy has discussed for Ayutla Mixtec, for example. We don't have foot tone, foot head, tone, head patterns going on. We do have, however, a consonantal contrast between Fortis and Lenis consonants. Now, what might be important is that if we're talking about correlates of stress, we actually don't really know precisely what the correlates of stress are in a precise way, because very little work has been done. No work has been done on this particular dialect, so we're really going by informal measurements that we've done of our field data, of things that we've collected in the field. But all Jean dialects do seem to, the descriptions indicate that stressed vowels are longer before Lenis consonants, and this is a strong effect in Zapotec in general. Intensity doesn't seem to be a strong correlate of stress, and well, we need to know more. However, in this particular case, we used different sequences. We used sequences that were dege, dege, dege. This not being a word, dege is not a word, and gede is not a word in this dialect. And we used a 7-point scale. These were recorded by a Zapotec speaker, and the setup was the same as it was before. So we first did a study where we varied only intensity and only duration, and this is what we found. So in this particular case where people were given sequences, and these were all intermingled, so they're all intermingled together. There were no consistent, the outcome of the study was not conclusive. So the next thing that we did was we did a version of study 2 with the Zapotec speakers. So we had the single parameter sequences and we had the covariate sequences as well. And so what we found was something very similar to what we found in Spanish and English, remarkably so. So what we have basically is, so what we have here is, this is the line that shows you intensity-only sequences. This is the line that shows you the duration-only sequences. And everything else are the covariate sequences. And what you see from the shading is that the loud-soft effect associated with intensity was very, very strong here as well. The odds of a loud-soft response in the intensity-only condition, 2 1/4 times more likely per unit of increase. Okay, so in the case of duration only, we actually, in this case, had something that we haven't seen with speakers of other languages. We saw an increase in long-short groupings as opposed to short-long groupings. So this is not something that we've seen before using speech-like stimuli. And intensity in the covariate conditions was also a very strong predictor of people's grouping asymmetries. And duration in the covariate conditions was also. So, and I should also note in leaving the Zapotec part that we found the same thing in the Zapotec covariate part that we did with especially the English speakers in study 2. We found that when you vary duration and intensity so that they compete, you do get duration taking away somewhat from the effect of intensity, but the dominant effect is the effect of intensity. Okay, something quite odd happened in the cooperating condition, but if you want to know about it, ask. There's an acoustic explanation. It's not a phonologically interesting explanation. So what do we know now that we didn't know before? Well, when listeners are asked to subjectively group alternating sequences of syllables in which intensity and duration are intensity is varied at different ratios. It doesn't matter if intensity is varied alone or if it's varied in combination with duration. Intensity is the most robust and consistent predictor of listeners' grouping asymmetries. And it was also true regardless of the listener's native language. But we will say that the Spanish speakers seem to be very sensitive to modulations in intensity, and the Zapotec and English speakers also, but not quite to the same extent. And so duration was a much weaker predictor of grouping biases. So what we might know now is that the uses that listeners made of duration information varied depending on the speaker's language. So in the duration-only condition, English speakers and Spanish speakers preferred short-long groupings, and the preference was strongest for the English speakers. And as noted, the Zapotec listeners had the opposite preference. In the covariate condition, duration had the effect that it decreased the odds of a loud, soft response. Somewhat in the competing conditions, this effect was weakest for the Spanish speakers and strongest for the Zapotec speakers, even though in the duration-only sequences, the Zapotec listeners had preferred long, short grouping. So this is an interesting finding. Now, the takeaway points, the initial goals were to see how listeners would use information about intensity and duration in making grouping choices and using this information to extend what we know of the Iambic-Trochaic law. Well, it seems that listeners have used available information differently than they've been reported to do in making judgments of stress. So we might be able to make a cautious interpretation here. We may have some evidence, at least, that bisyllabic units are an accessible unit in rhythmic sequences. However, there are some things that would need to be done as follow-ups for this. So so maybe to wrap up quickly is to note that the intensity scale in particular that we used in varying intensity was a very gross scale. So Matt Gordon, actually, wherever he is, kindly observed at one point that, 6 decibels means twice as loud, and so 12 decibels is enormously loud. That difference is a larger difference that we would normally find in naturally occurring speech. The reason that we did it this way is to have some consistency across different studies so that you can see, are we finding more or less what other people have found or not? So what really needs to happen then is that a production study would need to be done where you have a look and see what the actual correlates of various things, or at least if we're not talking about correlates of stress, then at least take the cues that you want to study, do a systematic study of how they pattern in the language, and then use that information to devise a more finely grained study of how people use these cues in judging grouping affinity. And I don't have any time to tell you about the glottalization thing, but the quick story is that if you pit glottalization against length in Zapotec, length seems to win, at least for a different kind of studies. So that's it, and I'll just say thank you.
Japanese have a different syntactic structure. So English has prepositions and Japanese has postpositions, and they use that to explain that effect. So does that apply at all to your Zapotec speakers? What kind of structure does that language have?
be honest, I always found that explanation a little lame, being a phonologist. But no, I don't think we can attribute. I don't think we could attribute this difference to that. But remember that the fact that Iverson found, they may have had that explanation for it, but they found very strong effects in both ways, depending on the group of speakers that they tested. So in other words, it wasn't that all of them preferred long-short. Some groups preferred long-short and others short-long. So not a consistent effect. Mm-hmm.
These results remind me of work that I did with Fred Laerdal on musical grouping and meter, where we explored also conditions, actually the very same conditions of playing off duration versus intensity and several other cues. And so I'm wondering whether it would be, and I think there was some experimental work done on that after our book by Emmanuel Bigon. And it might be worth asking whether these preferences are linguistic at all in that respect, that they're just a matter of, and we were basing our work on Wertheimer, 1923, by the way, so this is who was talking about this in visual grouping. So it's it may be a very general cognitive strategy.
That's a really, really fundamental point, and the truth is that not enough work has really been done with different groups of people, speakers of many languages, to establish that we really know what we may suspect, but that we know what the general tendencies are. And yes.
Well, I was going to say it would be interesting to try it with non-linguistic stimuli, to just do it with tones.
Yeah.
Then in order to isolate which parts of this have to do with language, are affected by the language. There's actually some work being done now in the music cognition community about how, to some extent, composers' metrical choices are affected by the metrical structure of their language.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of interactions that
perhaps we can talk about that. I'd like to know. I do think that more studies of the kind that Hay and Deal did are really needed. And what they did was they did the study with non-speech elements, and then they followed up with studies that use more speech-like things. And I think that that's a very useful thing to have done. And more of that should be done. Now, on the intensity effect in particular, it's very troubling that we have these enormous effects of intensity when people are asked to group things on that basis. And one thing that comes to mind is that we really might be talking about, we all know that duration has a demarcative function in marking the ends of things, but perhaps, maybe that's what the Iambic-Trochaic law means, is the intensity is also demarcative. But it would be, to know why things pattern in Zapotec in this particular way, it would be a useful thing in a language like that has morphologically determined stress, to see if intensity really marks the beginning of a prosodic word. So, for example, when people are given these tasks to do, in particular, you give them repeating groups of syllables, repeating pairs of syllables to parse. It looks like they are perceiving some kind of bisyllabic, they're parsing some kind of bisyllabic unit. But is it a foot or is it a small word? So, just a thought. Bruce.
Could you go back to the slide that says study 2 results for duration? That's the one, yes. And the one on the left, English. This is, I warn you, this is going to be a little bit off the wall, but it has to do with modeling your data with more fine-grained detail. Curves like your English curve there is what Kai Zura and I are getting over and over again in our work on stochastic phonology. Whenever we look at two intersecting constraint families that can incur different amounts of total violation and plot our data in the way that you did, we get curves that look rather like your curve. In particular, you get maximal dispersion in the middle and squeezing on the ends. In our data, actually going all the way up to 1 on the left side and 0 on the right side. At any rate, the way we get this is just to use harmonic grammar in any of its stochastic variants, that if you have constraint weights for the two families, in your case, a constraint weight star iambic if this degree of duration contrast, this, I'm curious, I can show you what we've been doing, but I wonder if some kind of application of harmonic grammar would actually permit an explicit model of all of your measurements.
Thank you. If you're talking about this, this effect right here, though, is that one of the things? Part of that, in one of those conditions, what that's showing you is that in the competing condition, you're getting more, as you increase duration, you're getting more short-long groupings. But in the cooperating, the other side of that is that in the cooperating condition, we got something a little unexpected. What we got was when you increase duration, you get more long-short groupings, not more short-long groupings. And I think that has an acoustic origin. It's basically the temporal summation of duration and intensity over time. If you make something longer, it starts sounding louder. And so we were actually getting some competition here where we didn't expect to.
So my interpretation of your graphs was an oversimplification.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So the question was whether the structure of Zapotec words, so I was wondering whether your speakers were grouping the Baga sequences as potential words.
Whether speakers were which?
Were perceiving the disyllabic sequences as potential words and factoring in possible phonological properties of disyllabic words in their language, for instance. So in particular, I was wondering about the unexpected result in Zapotec, the fact that long-short was a grouping preference.
Whether long-short would be a
So,
word
so
in
what
the
I'm
language?
wondering about is, in particular, whether in Zapotec you have a shortening of the final syllables, as you do in, let's say, Portuguese. So in that case, the basis of the response would be I mean, this is all hypothetical, right? I have no idea if Zapotec is like Portuguese in this respect, but the idea would be that you're looking not necessarily for a foot, but for a bisyllabic word.
Yeah, that's why I wonder what's happening. I'm having a hard time hearing you, so if my answer isn't off, it's not your fault. But I think that what we find is that in bisyllabic words, there's a, and they do exist. Nouns, for example, many nouns would be bisyllabic if they're unprefixed, and if the medial consonant is a Lenis consonant. Lenis consonants are basically, they're voiced and they're spirantized. And in those circumstances, you would have a long-short form. And so it's entirely possible. However, that would not be the case if the medial consonant is a fortis consonant. In that case, there wouldn't be. I've done some studies this summer where I've looked at, as I mentioned, length and creakiness, and designed the study to be able to sort of, and by the way, let's look at what happens when you change consonant fortition at the same time. And I have analyzed the data where the intervening consonants are fortis, and in the cases where when only length is involved, it's a short-long effect, which is interesting. Now, if it turns out, when I analyze the companion study, if it turns out that it goes the other way with the Lenis consonants, that would actually be a nice finding to go along with the one that we have. And it would be a language-specific difference, that feature that might be prompting that.